Hey everybody, welcome back to the Hunting Dog Confidential Podcast, Episode 3. I'm your host and resident gun dog nerd, Craig Koshyk. Have you ever been walking down the street or in the park with your dog and have someone point and say, "Hey, what kind of dog is that?" I mean, if you have a lab or a golden, you might get that a little less often because people know what those dogs are and they know their name and they can pronounce the name of those breeds. But if you have a little more obscure breed like I do, well, that question is quite common, actually. In fact, my dogs kind of look like other breeds and people don't know what breed it is, so they assume it's a mix of breeds. They'll say, "Hey, what kind of dog is that?" Or, "What kind of mix is your dog?" When I had Weimaraners, people would say things like, "Hey, nice greyhound." And I mean, it makes sense. It's a gray dog, so yeah, it must be a greyhound. Or they'd say, "Is that a really light-colored chocolate lab of some sort?" And even people who knew that it was a Weimaraner had a heck of a time getting the name out properly. They'd say things like, "Hey, nice Weimaraner," or Weisenheimer.
The thing I find most interesting in all this is that no matter where you are, people simply assume that the dog you're walking must be a purebred or it's a mix of pure breeds. And they also assume that there's a name for whatever breed it is or all of the breeds in the various crosses that made your mixed breed dog. But where did the idea of a breed actually come from? And why is it so important today? The very first thing we need to keep in mind is that the entire concept of a breed is a modern one. When our hunting dogs were first taking shape, the people that owned them, the ones that hunted with them and bred them, they never really thought of them as breeds in the way we do today. They thought of them as types of dogs, and for many of those folks, there were only one or two types of dogs around. They all kind of looked the same and they all kind of acted in the same way. Gaston Phébus was lucky though. Way back in the 1300s, he had a massive kennel with hundreds and hundreds of dogs. And he wrote a book about hunting and about hunting dogs. And in that book, he divided all of the dogs that he knew about into various groups. And they were divided mainly by the way that they were used or expected to work. Naturally, the dogs within those groups, they sort of looked alike. They shared an overall look. I mean, the Spaniels all have long or curly hair in the illustrations you see, and generally they were smaller than the tracking hounds that are also illustrated in that book. And the tracking hounds were generally short-haired, and all of the running dogs or different types of hounds used to seize game, well, they looked more like greyhounds or mastiffs or crosses between greyhounds and mastiffs. But one thing is clear, Gaston Phébus and all his hunter buddies, they never made any specific effort to keep their dogs quote-unquote pure as we would think of them today. They didn't close any stud book because they had no stud book to close. They simply bred dogs that worked well to other dogs that worked well. Sure, they often bred within a type. They would breed a spaniel-looking dog to a spaniel-looking dog or a tracking-looking dog to another tracking-looking dog. But they were absolutely not against the idea of mixing the various types of dogs to see if they could come up with something better. And there were also natural factors at play that would lead to types of dogs becoming even more specialized or gaining some sort of unique feature that would eventually lead to them becoming what we know as a breed today. Those were the Landraces that developed, basically types of dogs that developed or adapted to local conditions or to traditions and tastes. So if we took our time machine to the Bourbonnais region of central France in the 1600s or 1700s, we'd probably notice that almost all of the braque type dogs, the short-haired pointing dogs, were relatively small and they had white spotted coats, and a lot of them would have had a stubby tail or even no tail at all. But it's not because someone in that area sat down one day and said, "Okay boys, here's the kind of dog we're going to develop. It's going to look like this, it's going to behave like that, and we're going to hunt this in this way with that particular type of dog." No, the braque de Bourbonnais and all the other braque and épagneul breeds ended up the way they were back then because genes for the features that made them unique just happened to occur in a certain region. Hunters simply found certain dogs with certain features to be appealing for whatever reason. They liked the look, they loved the way they worked, they were perfect for the game and the terrain in that area. Any dog that didn't meet the requirements of hunters and people back then, well, it just didn't get bred. The ones that did, they were bred. I mean, if we set our time machine to that same era, but we went to, Ireland, we'd see a lot of dogs that look like setters, and most of them will have red and white or red coats. Set the dial to somewhere in Spain around that same time, you'd see a lot of blocky, houndy-looking pointing dogs. And you'd notice that a lot of them have double noses or split noses. But the one thing you would never come across is anyone claiming that those dogs were created from some master plan or following some written standard. And no one would have used the term breed to describe them, because they were not breeds as we know them today. They were types of dogs. They were land races of locally developed dogs. Yeah, the word breed was around at that time, but it was basically a synonym for words like strain or line or type or variety or even species. They all meant the same thing, and authors often used them interchangeably, even in the same sentence. In Edward Laverick's book, The Setter, which he wrote and published in around 1872, you can see this happening all the time. There are so many sentences and paragraphs where the words breed and strain and race and variety and class are all used to mean the same thing. He's talking about a type of dog or a closely related group of dogs, usually owned by some rich dude. But basically, he's using the term breed and strain and line and variety to mean the same thing. Here's an example. He wrote, quote, "If I had not kept my breed of Blue Beltons pure, this rare old strain would have degenerated." So right there, he's talking about his Blue Beltons, his setters that he had, as a breed or a strain, same thing. He also wrote, "In my young days, almost every grouse shooter had his own particular breed or strain." And here's how he described the Earl of Tankerville's jet black setters, quote, "Another breed of rare excellence and greatly appreciated by practical sportsmen was certainly one of the best, most useful and beautiful strains I ever saw. There is no better test of a pure breed of setters than a perfect uniformity of race." Now, those are just a couple of examples from one book, basically from Edward Laverick's book, The Setter. But read any of the books published around that time, or magazine articles, or letters even written by people around that same time, you'll find the same thing. Terms like breed, race, species, type, class, they were all bandied about, and they all meant basically the same thing. But it was around that same time when all of the first canine registries and kennel clubs and breed clubs were starting to form. They were busy declaring official names and writing standards for all the various kinds of dogs that existed at that time. And they were struggling to keep up with all the new or quote-unquote rediscovered kinds of dogs people were eager to promote. But before they could do that, they had to establish exactly what the terms breed and strain and variety and class and other terms meant. Because so many people, including the most influential authors and canine experts, were using those terms interchangeably, there was a lot of confusion. In 1884, French dog expert Ernest Bellecroix was astonished when he realizes that at one show he was supposed to judge, there were over 150 different classes. In a newspaper article published after the show, he wrote, "We were crushed under a completely unexpected number of classes, and of all those different classifications, we had no idea which ones were correct. Even the owners of dogs sometimes had no idea what kind of dog they owned or bred, and often would enter them into the wrong class at a dog show or field trial. So, we request that the Kennel Club please define these breeds once and for all, and clearly describe their characteristics." Eventually, organizers did get things under control, and one of the most important steps they took was to drop certain terms like race and species when speaking about dogs. So starting around, 1890, 95, people generally agreed that a breed was not just a group of dogs that were, consistent enough in type to be grouped together, but it was a group of closely related dogs that had an official conformation standard, had an official name, had a stud book, and all the records of parentage were kept in that stud book. And that is what the term breed came to mean in the dog world, and it's the term that we still use today, and the meaning still holds. Anybody who speaks about a quote-unquote breed dating back more than 200 years is really talking about a type of dog, or a landrace of dog, or at the most a strain of dog bred by one rich dude in some castle somewhere. But they weren't breeds as we think of them today. Nevertheless, despite the best efforts of everybody involved, the change was slow to come. Even up to the 20s and 30s, the terms breed and strain were sometimes interchanged. A good example is from 1902 in the second edition of the Field Dog Studbook, when a new breed, the Llewellyn Setter, was added. The official explanation as to why it was added is found in the introduction. Quote, "For the benefit of those breeders who wish to preserve the Llewellyn Setter in its purity, it has been deemed wise to bring together in a separate list the names of as many of this group of dogs as possible. It has now been 30 years since this breed was created, and during that time a great many generations have been bred and much outside blood has been introduced into the breed. It is therefore becoming more and more difficult each year to trace the bloodlines of these dogs." Unquote. Almost immediately after that edition was published, the author, Dr. Rowe, realized he'd made a mistake. He used the word breed to describe the Llewellyn when he should have used the word strain. So, when he wrote the introduction to the studbook published the very next year, he included the following correction in the introduction. Quote, "Errata, Volume 2, Llewellyn Setters, page 9. Change the word breed in the 5th line to strain." Unfortunately, it was a bit too little, too late. People continued to call the Llewellyn Setter a breed, and even today there are some Llewellyn folks that insist that the Llewellyn is a breed, not a strain, even though Dr. Rowe caught his error and admitted it 125 years ago. In any case, today we have dog breeds, and they all have official names and standards, clubs, and studbooks. And some of the old words that were used back then are still with us. Dog shows have classes, and there are officially recognized varieties within some breeds. And unofficially, there are some well-known strains or lines as well. I mean, who hasn't heard of an Elhew or a Miller Pointer? But how many breeds are there now? Well, it depends on who you ask. Different kennel clubs and canine registries give different numbers. The most recent number I could get from the American Kennel Club indicates that they recognize 201 dog breeds. But is that all? Is that the total number of breeds in the world? No. There are surely a lot more that are simply not recognized by any registry or kennel club. Or if they are recognized by a kennel club, it is some national or local kennel club that recognizes them, whereby the national body or the international body doesn't. How many of those breeds exist? I don't really know, but I know the number is not insignificant. In pointing dogs alone, I mean, that's my wheelhouse. I can tell you for a fact that there are at least 3 or 4 breeds out there that are not recognized by the AKC or FCI or UKC. They have official names and standards and even breed clubs, but they're only recognized by local registries, not by any international body. When I first started to research the history and development of pointing dogs, I figured there were maybe, a dozen or so breeds. But the more digging I did, the more breeds I found. And after nearly a dozen years of digging, I finally came up with a total of 52 distinct breeds of pointing dogs. Well, not quite 52. Some of those breeds are extinct now, and a couple of them never really existed except in the imaginations of some people back in the day. Even so, in my first book, Pointing Dogs Volume 1, I described nearly 40 different breeds that still exist to this day. Some are wildly popular, like the GSP, and some are just hanging on by their toenails, like the Ponto de Mer. But there are still a lot of pointing dog breeds out there. And it's interesting to see how various kennel clubs classify them, and which names and standards they use. When I first started writing my books, I decided to use the FCI system as a sort of template for my work, for a number of reasons. First of all, in the FCI, each breed is considered the property of a specific country. Usually it's the country in which the breed was first developed. And that means all the conformation and working standard published by the FCI are from the breed's parent country. And those standards are published in 4 languages: English, French, Spanish, and German. And the FCI provides annual registration statistics and other information that other canine organizations don't. Most importantly, at least for my work with pointing dogs, the FCI places all the pointing breeds in one group. It's called Group 7. And that Group 7 is then subdivided into two subgroups, one for continental pointing dogs and the other for British and Irish pointers and setters. And so that's why I actually published 2 volumes. I published volume 1 for the continental breeds and volume 2 for the British and Irish breeds. It basically follows the logic of the Group 7, the FCI's Group 7 for pointing dogs. Here in North America, we don't divide them that way. All pointing dogs are basically lumped together and they'll compete against each other in field trials and in shows. Whereas in Europe or in the FCI rules, continental pointing breeds will only run in trials against other continentals, and British and Irish breeds will only run against British and Irish breeds in field trials. And here in North America, the largest organization dedicated to the testing and registration of pointing breeds is NAVDA. And so far, they only recognize about 30 breeds of pointing dogs. There's still 2 or 3 out there that they haven't been recognized, but it's not because they don't want to recognize them, it's because there may not even be any individuals from those breeds in North America to register or to test. But no matter what the registry, a breed has to have an official confirmation standard and an official name. In some registries and in some breeds, there's also an official working standard. It's published and used by judges to evaluate dogs in field trials and tests in the same way judges evaluate conformation in dog shows. Personally, I wish all hunting breeds had a working standard, an official description of the ideal way that dog should go about doing its job. But that's just me. When it comes to breed names, though, that's where things get really interesting. Do you know how and why your breed got its name? Do you know what it's called in other countries? Do you know what it's called in its country of origin? For some folks, the answer is yes, because all the information they need is in the breed name. I mean, an Irish Water Spaniel is a Water Spaniel from Ireland. That's pretty straightforward. An English Setter? Well, it's a Setter from England. A Golden Retriever? Well, it's a dog with a golden yellow coat that retrieves. A Pointer? Points. Easy peasy. But what about breeds like the Poodle Pointer? Is it a poodle? Is it a pointer? What kind of poodle went into it? What kind of pointer? And who the heck chose that name for it? And what the heck does Wachtelhund mean, or Perdigero? And why did the Americans and British drop the Spaniel part of the Brittany's name? Whenever I write a breed profile for a book or magazine article, I almost always include at least some information about the breed's name because I find it really cool and interesting. In some cases, the name is pretty straightforward and the origins are easy to find. I mean, the German pointing breeds, at least a few of them, have really practical names. Translated into English, German Shorthair, German Wirehair, German Long-haired Pointer. Easy peasy. It's the name of the country of origin and the type of coat. Those names work perfectly well in German. But once they're translated, things can get a little tricky. Due to differences in registries, testing organizations, breed clubs, and other factors, it's just way too complicated to get into today. Some people call those breeds by their original German name and some by the translated English name. But why? Again, that's too complicated to delve into right now, but in a nutshell, if you ask an English speaker in the US or Canada about their dog, and they tell you it is a Deutsch Drahthaar, or a Deutsch Langhaar, or a Deutsch Kurzhaar, they are signaling to you that their dog is, in some way, affiliated with the breed's parent club back in Germany, and that their dog is similar, if not identical, to the same dogs in Germany. Now, if they say they have a German Shorthair, or a German Wirehair, or a German Longhair, well, the connection to the parent club in Germany and its testing and breeding system is probably not as direct as the dog owned by a guy who calls it a Drahthaar or a Longhaar. So there's a little bit extra to their names. It depends on which name a person uses for their dog. Both names, I guess, are correct. The German name is the German name. The English name is the translation of that German name. But there's some background to it that is interesting and valuable depending on what you want to know about that particular dog and its breeding. The same thing applies to Brittany's. If you see a compact, bobtailed rocket in the field and the owner tells you it's a Breton instead of a Brittany, well, that tells you something about that dog's connection and the owner's connection to the old country of France. Even Labrador owners may say that their lab is a lab or a British lab, or somebody has a cocker, they might tell you that they've got a British or English cocker or a working cocker, because they want to differentiate it from the other types within the overall breed. As I was writing my first book, I realized that I needed to figure out exactly what to call each breed. And I also decided to put a little blurb in each chapter, sort of explaining where the name came from, what it means in its country of origin, and even a little bit of a pronunciation guide in terms of how an English speaker could best say that name if he wanted to be accurate in terms of pronouncing it as it is in the home country. But if all we have to go on is a breed's name, what exactly can we learn about that particular breed? Well, for some of them, we can figure out where they come from. I mean, German Shorthairs, they come from Germany. Münsterlanders come from a region of Germany called Münsterland. And the Weimaraner, well, it's named after a city in Germany, and the Ponto de Mer is named after a city in France. In fact, most of the French breeds are named after regions of France, and both the Italian pointing breeds, the braque italiano and the spinone italiano, have Italiano in their name, meaning they come from Italy. On the other hand, there's the Labrador, which doesn't actually come from Labrador. At least, not directly. The breed was actually developed in England, but for some reason it was named for a place across the ocean. For some breeds, their name tells us something about the way they look. There's the Irish Red Setter and the Irish Red and White Setter and the Golden Retriever. Their name tells us what color they are. Even the old extinct breed called the tri-colored Württemberg Pointer is like that. And almost all of the wire-haired breeds have something in their name referring to their type of coat. There's the wire-haired pointing griffon, German wire-haired pointer, and the wire-haired vizsla. Even the Spinone's name refers to its coat because Spinone comes from the Italian word spina, which means thorn, and it simply refers to sort of the feel or the prickly nature of the coat. Stickelhaar is similar. Stickel in German refers to a chisel or an awl, basically something really strong and sharp and pointy, like their coat. And even the name Český Fosek refers to the coat because Fosek means beard or bearded. The name of that breed in English is basically the bearded Czech, the Český Fosek. Among retrievers, we have a flat-coated retriever, a wavy-coated retriever, and a curly-coated retriever. And then there's a breed whose name doesn't indicate the color or length of its coat, it indicates the shape of its nose. It's the old Spanish double-nosed pointer. When I first read about those dogs, I had no idea what a double nose was. Some people suggested that it just meant the dog that had a nose that could do double duty. It could foot scent and air scent. But I wasn't convinced. So I kept digging, and I eventually found out exactly what a double-nosed Spanish pointer is and what it looks like, because I found a breeder in northern Spain that still breeds them to this day. The breed today is called Pachon Navarro, but they are basically old Spanish pointers with a double nose. I remember pulling up into his driveway and greeting him and his wife with a hearty handshake and a hello, how are you? And then they opened the kennel doors and out came these most amazing looking dogs. They kind of looked like pointers in that they had long ears and were sort of pointer shaped, but with much shorter legs and a more barrel-chested sort of blocky overall build. They were super friendly. They came up and they were wagging their tails and trying to get up to our lap and we're patting them. And then we saw the nose. And let me tell you, at first you're sort of taken aback because I had never seen a nose like that before. I hadn't even imagined a nose like that before. But basically, if you imagine your dog's nose or even look at your dog's nose now, you'll see that there's a small crease running at the top of its muzzle and that crease goes down between the nostrils. In some dogs, it's barely visible. In other ones, you can kind of see it depending on the color of their nose and the shape of their nose. But it's very shallow and very narrow. Now, with these double-nosed pointers, it's not shallow and it's not narrow. It's huge. It looks like they were hit with a cleaver at some point. I mean, it's a really big, noticeable divide. When you actually hold the dog's muzzle in your hand and stare right into its eyes or right down its nose, it looks like you're staring at the end of a double-barrel shotgun. That's the double nose. Now, physiologically speaking, biologically speaking, it is called a bifid nose. I mean, it can happen in almost every mammal, I suppose, that has a nose. It's kind of like a hair lip in a human, and it can happen in any breed of dog. In some dog standards, it will say actually that any type of a bifid or split nose is a disqualification, because for most breeds and for most people, seeing something like that is just, I guess, not appealing, but also could actually be a handicap. Within the Pichon Navarro breed, there will be a number of pups born in a certain number of litters that will actually have such a deep and profound division between those two nostrils that they can't even suckle. So, of course, they're put down and they are never bred from. So, in a lot of breeds, it's seen as a fault or sort of a physical defect. But for some reason, somewhere down the line, way back somewhere in Spain, somebody looked at it and thought, you know what? That's a cool feature. Let's keep it. Let's not put those dogs down. In fact, let's select specifically for that particular feature. We can all speculate as to why. My theory is that at some point in time, somebody just happened to have a dog with a bifid nose that was a super good dog, that had a really good nose, that was really able to scent game from far away. And they probably thought, you know what? The reason that it's so good is because it's got a double nose. Therefore, let's continue to breed for this double nose. Today, we would know that that's not really an accurate sort of sense of things. That double nose probably doesn't work any better than a single nose. But it caught on, and to this day, we have double nose pointers out there called Pichon Navarro. And I absolutely loved my visit there. I loved those dogs. They were super cool. To this date, I know of none here in North America, but there is a club in Spain for them. And there's several hundred are born every year with a number of breeders still active in the breed to this day. Sometimes the breed name tells us what sort of game the breed was developed to handle and even how it should go about it. The best example of that is the Nova Scotia duck-tolling retriever. Not only does the name tell us where the breed was developed, in Nova Scotia, Canada, it tells us that the breed specializes in tolling ducks and fetching them. If you're unfamiliar with tolling, take a look for the episode Jennifer and I did of Hunting Dog Confidential. We did a whole episode about duck tolling. It's really an interesting thing to research. So I won't go into too much detail here, but basically tolling is a technique that hunters use to lure rafting ducks closer to the shore so they can get a shot at them. I mean, we've all been there, right? You're on the shore, you're waiting for some ducks to fly. They're not flying because they're all out in the middle of the lake or the middle of the bay. It's a nice day and they're just chilling there. They ain't going anywhere. Well, if you have a trained dog, you might be able to toll them. Basically, you'd go and hide, except the dog would stay on the shore. And somehow you would get that dog to play. You'd throw rocks or throw sticks or throw a tennis ball. So it's going back and forth. And for some reason, ducks and geese are attracted to a dog or a fox or a coyote romping on a beach. Any kind of canine they see playing around on the beach kind of gets their interest. So typically they'll move in closer to get a closer look. And when they're close enough, well, that's when you spring out, flush the birds, and take your shot. Any birds that fall, well, your tolling dog now turns into a retriever. And there are other breeds that have the name of their favorite quarry in their breed name. The Drent Patrijshond, for example. Its name means partridge dog, Patrijshond, partridge dog. The Portuguese pointer and the Burgos pointer are both called perdiguero in Portuguese and in Spanish. And perdiguero comes from the Latin perdix, which means partridge. So basically, the Portuguese pointer and the Burgos pointer are both Portuguese or Burgos partridge dogs. Then there's the German dog called the Wachtelhund. Well, Wachtel is the German word for quail. So basically, a Wachtelhund, its name means quail dog. And then there are names that indicate that there is some sort of connection to a person. The Duke of Gordon, for example, didn't actually create the Gordon setter, but the breed was named after him. In much of the world, the wire-haired pointing griffon is actually called the Courtals griffon, named after its founder, Edward Courtals. There were a few other griffon breeds named after some rich guy that founded them as well, the Boulet griffon, the Guerlain griffon. And even the braque Dupuis was named after a pair of brothers called Dupuis. But those breeds are all gone now. They went extinct shortly after their founders died. Another thing I found interesting and, to be honest, quite frustrating was, number one, how to pronounce some of these words in their native language. I've already butchered a few during this podcast, but not only are they difficult to pronounce, they can be really tricky to actually translate. For example, the French word épagneul is translated as spaniel in English, but that can cause all sorts of confusion because spaniel in the English-speaking world refers to a dog that flushes. You got Springer Spaniels, Cocker Spaniels, Sussex, Clumber Spaniels. They flush birds. They're not pointing dogs. But then you have the Brittany Spaniel, the Picardy Spaniel, the French Spaniel, the Pinto de Mer Spaniel, all these other quote-unquote Spaniel breeds. It's because their name in French is épagneul. I have épagneul Picard, Picardy Spaniels. But that name causes so much confusion that I'm actually quite tired of trying to explain it to people. When I'm walking my dog, hey, what kind of dog is that? It's a Picardy Spaniel. Oh, wow, is that like a Springer? No, it's not like a Springer. I have to explain every time. And anybody who has one of these breeds, I'm sure listening to this has come across that same situation where you have to kind of explain, yes, the name is Spaniel, but no, it doesn't work like a Spaniel. It works more like a setter. And to me, that would have been the ideal situation. Long ago, instead of translating épagneul to Spaniel, they should have translated it to setter. Then people with Picardy Spaniels could go around saying, I have a Picardy setter, or a French setter, or a Pinto de Mer setter, or a Saint-Eustache setter. It would make my life and the life of a lot of people much easier if that had occurred. But it didn't, and we live with it today. And then there are other breed names or terms that are kind of generic. So I just mentioned épagneul. Épagneul simply means long-haired pointing dog, or setter, basically in French, translated, unfortunately, to spaniel. But what about the French word braque? Well, it's a fairly generic thing. It just means short-haired pointing dog. So we have the braque français, we have the braque bourbonnais, we have various braques. In fact, I mean, even the GSP, it's a German short-haired pointing dog in English. In French, it's braque allemand. In other words, a German braque because it's a short-haired pointing dog. The word vizsla is actually similar too, the Hungarian word vizsla. Just like braque, it's a word that simply means short-haired pointing dog. So Hungarians don't call their dogs just vizslas, they call them Magyar vizslas, Hungarian vizsla. And a German short-hair pointer, they call a Német vizsla. Braque Français, they'll call it a Francia vizsla. Basically, to them, vizsla means the same thing as braque, short-haired pointing dog. So how do other countries translate the English names of English breeds? What do the French call pointers and what do the Germans call setters? How are those names translated? Well, they're not. We English speakers, we spend a lot of time translating some of the names, not all of them, but some of the names we translate into English so we can get our mouth around them. Whereas a lot of the Europeans, they don't translate them at all. They just keep the original English name for the breed, but they pronounce them with the super strong local accent. One of my favorites is my friend in France pronouncing Irish Water Spaniel. He uses the English word for it. He calls it the Irish Water Spaniel. And a Cocker Spaniel to him is a Cocker Spaniel. And English setter, well, they translate part of that. They'll translate the English part. They'll call it a setter anglais or a setter Gordon for the Gordon setter. Germans call pointers pointers. Germans call setters setters. Most of the European world will use the English terms for those particular dogs. And that's one of the strangest things too. Remember, épagneul is translated as spaniel. Do the French translate it back the other way? Do they take a Springer Spaniel and call it an épagneul Springer? No, they don't. They actually call it a Springer Spaniel or a Cocker Spaniel or a Sussex Spaniel. They take the English word and they just throw a really thick French accent on top of it and call it a day. So the next time you're thinking about your dog and its breed and the history of its breed, why not have a look at where its name came from and give a shot at pronouncing the name in the language of the country it came from. It's a lot of fun and you could learn a lot about your dog or at least about the breed. I find it endlessly fascinating to go down these rabbit holes and I hope you guys do too. And with that, I will conclude episode 3 of the Hunting Dog Confidential podcast and wish you happy hunting. And in the words of my friend Rick Sojda, a Český Fosek owner, may you shoot straight and often. Bye for now.